the 11th of September 1941. Franklin D. Roosevelt sat in the Oval Office, speaking into a microphone to the entire nation. His voice was low and angry, like a peaceful man pushed too far by a bully. He told the American people, "Just a few days ago, on September 4th, our destroyer, the USS Greer, while carrying mail to Iceland, was attacked by a German submarine with torpedoes, completely without provocation." Roosevelt paused, then delivered the famous metaphor. "When you see a rattlesnake poised to strike, you do not wait until he has struck before you crush him. You crush him before he strikes." Then he issued the order that changed history: shoot on sight. From this day forward, if the U.S. Navy sees a German submarine in the Atlantic, no warning is needed. Sink it immediately. America was enraged. Everyone felt that Nazi Germany was too arrogant to attack our innocent mail carrier on a peaceful morning. But Roosevelt didn't tell the American people the whole truth. Or rather, he omitted 90% of the key details. What was the truth? That morning, the USS Greer was no innocent mail carrier. It was actively coordinating with a British bomber to hunt down that German submarine, U-652, for 3 long hours. The Greer locked onto the sub with sonar and radioed the coordinates to the British plane. The British plane flew over and dropped 4 depth charges. The German sub, concussed and desperate, fired a torpedo at the Greer in self-defense and missed. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that Roosevelt finally had the excuse he had been dreaming of. He packaged an active hunt as passive victimhood. He used this staged incident to slice off the thickest piece of the neutrality sausage. In reality, from this day on, the U.S. was already at war with Germany in the Atlantic. This is the famous undeclared war. In this story, Roosevelt is not the kindly old man in a wheelchair waiting for peace. He is a psychological master with a scalpel. Standing before the map of the Atlantic, he pushed the red line step by step right up to Hitler's nose, gambling that the madman would lose control and fire the first shot. To understand why Roosevelt played this baiting game in the Atlantic, we must go back to 1939. At that time, Roosevelt was arguably the most frustrated president in the world. World War II had erupted in Europe. Hitler's tanks were crushing Poland. Roosevelt knew better than anyone that if Germany wasn't stopped, America was next. But he couldn't move, because the U.S. Congress, determined to prevent a repeat of WWII, had handcuffed him with the strict Neutrality Acts. These laws said, America absolutely cannot sell weapons to belligerents, American ships cannot enter war zones, and American banks cannot lend money to warring nations. It was a pair of handcuffs, locking Roosevelt to the pillar of isolationism. If Roosevelt dared to say we need to help Britain, he would be impeached the next day for breaking the law. Facing this deadlock, Roosevelt used his signature move, Salami Slicing tactics. Since he couldn't abolish the Neutrality Acts in one go, he would slice them thin, feeding them to the American people one piece at a time. The first slice was called Cash and Carry. September 1939. War had just started. Britain and France desperately needed U.S. weapons, but the law forbade it. Roosevelt went to Congress and lobbied them like a businessman. Gentlemen, look at our factories. The Great Depression isn't over. We need orders. If we ban the arms trade, we hurt the American economy. How about we change it like this? We can sell weapons to warring nations, but on 2 conditions. First, they must pay cash, no credit, so we don't get into debt disputes like WWII. Second, they must carry it on their own ships. No U.S. delivery, so our ships won't get sunk and we won't get dragged into war. Congress thought it made sense. Profit without risk, pure business. So, the amendment passed. But hidden inside was a massive trap. It looked fair, anyone can buy, but in reality only Britain and France had the navy and merchant fleet to cross the Atlantic. German merchant ships were blockaded in port by the British Navy. So, neutral trade effectively became Britain's exclusive arsenal. This was the first slice, breaking the arms embargo in the name of business. But this didn't last long. The situation worsened. Summer 1940, France surrendered. The British Expeditionary Force escaped Dunkirk, but lost all their heavy equipment. Worse, German U-boats were slaughtering British supply ships in the Atlantic. The Royal Navy's destroyers, the bodyguards against subs, were running out. Churchill telegrammed Roosevelt daily, practically begging, "Mr. President, if we don't get ships, the British Empire will suffocate." This led to the second slice, destroyers for bases. Facing an election, Roosevelt didn't dare ask Congress to give ships. So he bypassed Congress, using executive power to pull 50 old WWII destroyers' four-stack coffins out of mothballs and gave them to Britain. To silence the isolationists, Roosevelt packaged this military aid as a shrewd real estate deal. He told Americans, "Don't panic. I didn't give them away for free. I traded these 50 scrap heaps for 99-year leases on 8 British naval bases in the Caribbean and Canada. This pushes America's defense perimeter out by thousands of miles. I am defending the homeland." The public thought, hey, 50 old ships for 8 strategic bases. The president is a smart real estate mogul. Great deal. But in reality, it wasn't just giving ships. Once those 50 ships flew the British flag, American naval assets were substantively involved in the war against Germany. Roosevelt had dipped America's toe into the muddy waters of war. However, by early 1941, a bigger crisis arrived. Britain ran out of money. The cash part of cash and carry failed because Britain had no gold or dollars left to pay. Churchill wrote a top-secret letter to Roosevelt. "The British Empire is bankrupt. We can't afford a single bullet." This was a dead end. If he didn't send weapons, Britain would surrender in months, Hitler would control the Atlantic, and America was next. But if he sent weapons for free, he was giving taxpayer money to foreigners. Isolationists in Congress would explode. This isn't neutrality. This is spending America's inheritance on war. Facing this, Roosevelt showed his genius for sophistry. He had to change giving money to lending stuff and joining war to self-defense. On the 17th of December 1940, at a press conference, Roosevelt dropped the most famous metaphor in history, the garden hose. He bamboozled the reporters like this: "Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire, and the fire looks like it might spread to my house. What do? Do I say, 'Neighbor, my garden hose costs $15, you have to pay me $15 before I let you use it'? No, I'm not that stupid. I lend him the hose to put out the fire. I don't need the money now. When the fire is out, he gives me the hose back. If it breaks, he replaces it." This metaphor was brilliant. It instantly shifted the focus from hated financial debt to fire prevention. But isolationists weren't fools. They countered, "This bill gives the president dictatorial powers. It's a fast track to send American boys to war." To hit back, Roosevelt used the ultimate weapon in a fireside chat fear. He told American parents, "We are sending guns to Britain precisely to keep American boys out of the war." Think about it. Is it better to spend money now so British soldiers can fight Nazis with American guns? Or wait until Britain falls, let the Nazis land in New York, and have our own children fight them? It was ruthless. Roosevelt packaged aid to Britain as an insurance premium for America. He convinced Americans, "We are hiring the British to fight for us." Under this logic, in March 1941, Congress finally passed the Lend-Lease Act. But making weapons for Britain was step one. Transporting them was step 2. The Atlantic was a hunting ground for U-boats. Half of the supplies were sinking to the bottom of the ocean. If transport wasn't safe, Lend-Lease was useless paper. Yet, U.S. law still forbade U.S. warships from escorting British convoys. Here, Roosevelt made the boldest, most unreasonable slice. The Pan-American Security Zone. International law said territorial waters were 3 miles out. Roosevelt took a map, drew a line down the middle of the Atlantic to the 26th meridian. This line included Iceland. Roosevelt announced, "This is the Western Hemisphere Defense Zone, America's backyard. To prevent war from reaching the Americas, the U.S. Navy has the right to conduct neutrality patrols here." This was pure gangster logic. Roosevelt's goal was clear: legally send U.S. warships to the middle of the Atlantic. Superficially, they were patrolling. In reality, they were scouts for the British. Once a U.S. ship found a U-boat, it couldn't fire, but it would trail the sub and broadcast the coordinates on open radio. British planes and destroyers would hear the broadcast and swarm in with depth charges. Neutrality? This was rigging the fight. So, on the cold Atlantic, a carefully designed game of cat and mouse began. U.S. ships drifted like ghosts, lights out, hunting for U-boats. Roosevelt was waiting. He was waiting for a Greer moment, waiting for a German sub to fire at a U.S. ship. He was waiting for Hitler to lose his mind. But to his surprise, Hitler showed astonishing patience. Because Hitler was preparing to invade the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, he knew if he angered the U.S. now, Germany would face a two-front war. So, Hitler ordered U-boat commander Dönitz, "Do not provoke U.S. ships. Even if Americans sit on your head, as long as you don't sink, do not fire back." This created an absurd dark comedy. In the Atlantic, the world's 2 most powerful navies were playing hide-and-seek. Roosevelt was desperately trying to stage an accident, offering U.S. ships as bait. Hitler was desperately dodging, making U-boats dive whenever they saw an American flag. Who would blink first? Roosevelt watched the Germans refusing to fire and got anxious. So, he decided, if slicing is too slow, add some hot sauce. He pushed the patrol line all the way to Iceland, right under Hitler's nose. July 1941. Roosevelt sent U.S. Marines to occupy Iceland. Why occupy freezing Iceland? It was a massive open conspiracy. Since U.S. troops are in Iceland, doesn't the U.S. Navy have a duty to escort U.S. supply ships to Iceland? Of course. And if, on this escort route, a few hundred British merchant ships just happened to tag along, doesn't the U.S. Navy have to protect them too? You see, this is the masterstroke. Roosevelt pushed the U.S. Navy's escort endpoint from the mid-Atlantic thousands of miles east, right to Nazi Germany's doorstep. Now, life for German U-boats was impossible. Before, they shot on sight. Now they had to surface, use binoculars to check, is that American or British? If American, they had to hold their breath and dive. But there is no gun that never misfires. Roosevelt finally got the excuse he dreamed of. The 4th of September 1941, the USS Greer was carrying mail to Iceland. Suddenly, a British bomber flew overhead and told the Greer, "German U-boat, U-652, 10 miles ahead." The Greer accelerated. It didn't fire, but it turned on active sonar, locking onto the sub, like a large man shining a flashlight in your face, not hitting you, but shouting your location to the police behind you. The Greer tracked the sub for 3 hours, radioing coordinates to the British plane. The plane dropped depth charges. The German commander underwater panicked. In fear of death, he turned his tubes and fired a torpedo at the Greer. Of course, in the panic, it missed. No one was hurt. But for Roosevelt, it was enough. He didn't need a corpse. He just needed the fact that Germans fired first. Then, as we heard in the beginning, Roosevelt used this to announce the shoot-on-sight order. He ordered the Navy, "From today, any Axis warship in the Atlantic, sink it without warning." This meant that, although Congress hadn't declared war, the US was substantively at war with Germany in the Atlantic. According to Roosevelt's script, massive naval battles should have erupted, a few hundred dead Americans, and Congress would be forced to declare war. But to Roosevelt's frustration, Hitler, the madman, held back again. Hitler saw through the trap. He warned his U-boats again, "Even if detected by sonar, do not fire back." Until October 31, tragedy finally struck. The U.S. destroyer Reuben James was hit by a German torpedo while escorting a convoy. This wasn't a mistake, it was a direct hit. The magazine exploded, the ship broke in two and sank in 5 minutes. 115 American sailors died. The first U.S. warship sunk in World War II. When the news reached the White House, Roosevelt's first reaction might not have been grief, but a cold expectation. He thought, "This is it, right? Over 100 dead. Congress has to declare war now." But reality slapped Roosevelt in the face. The power of isolationism was terrifying. Opponents in Congress argued, "It's a tragedy." But the Reuben James was in a war zone. It took the risk. We cannot drag the whole nation into a world war over one ship. Roosevelt was desperate. He had sliced every sausage, used every bait, even sacrificed over 100 lives, but he still couldn't move the elephant that was America. He admitted in his diary, "Unless Germany attacks us on a massive scale, I cannot get Congress to declare war." In this deadlock, Roosevelt looked away from the Atlantic. He realized, if the front door, Germany, won't open, try the back door. The back door was Japan. Japan at the time was a gambler stuck in the quagmire of China. Roosevelt knew Japan had a fatal weakness: oil. Japan was resource poor. 80% of the blood flowing in its war machine oil came from the US. Roosevelt held Japan's oxygen tube. He could pinch it shut any time. But he didn't pinch it shut immediately. He used the salami slicing tactic again. Not slicing laws, but slicing Japan's life. First slice: scrap metal, 1,940. To warn Japan, Roosevelt restricted scrap iron and aviation fuel exports. It hurt, but not enough to make Japan fight. But Japan didn't listen. July 1941. Japan occupied French Indochina, preparing to jump into Southeast Asia. This crossed Roosevelt's red line, so he cut the second, fatal slice: freezing assets. The 26th of July, 1941, Roosevelt signed the order freezing all Japanese assets in the U.S. This meant Japan had no money to buy anything. Then, on August 1, the U.S. imposed a total oil embargo. Britain and the Dutch followed suit. Japan went crazy. Without oil, the combined fleet was floating trash. The Japanese military calculated, without war, oil reserves last 2 years. With war, 18 months. Roosevelt hung a countdown clock on the Japanese empire. Either crawl back home like a dog or lunge out like a wolf. Did Roosevelt know which path Japan would choose? Of course. U.S. intelligence magic had broken Japanese codes. Roosevelt was playing poker while seeing the opponent's cards. He knew the Bushido-crazed Japanese would never accept the humiliation of withdrawal. So, the oil embargo was essentially an invisible declaration of war. By November 1941, the explosion was imminent. Japan sent envoys to Washington for a last struggle. But Roosevelt didn't want to talk. He had Secretary of State Hull hand them the Hull note. The content was incredibly harsh, Japan must withdraw completely from China and Indochina. For Japan, this was a demand to commit seppuku. The envoys turned pale. They knew, the Americans aren't negotiating, they are forcing us to shoot. Finally, the 7th of December, 1941, Pearl Harbor. When the news reached the White House, Roosevelt's reaction wasn't shock or fear. According to aides, he showed an unprecedented sense of relief. He wrote in his diary, "Despite the heavy casualties, the uncertainty hanging in the air is finally over." Japan's bombs shattered the isolationist voices at home, but it wasn't perfect yet. Roosevelt still wanted to fight Germany. If only Japan declared war, Congress might only fight Japan and ignore Germany. Then, Roosevelt got the luckiest break of his life. December 11, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler made a decision that defied strategic reason. Based on the Tripartite Pact and underestimating America, Hitler went to the Reichstag and declared war on the US. When Roosevelt heard this, he probably laughed inside. The hardest piece of sausage. Hitler swallowed it himself. The deadlock that plagued him for 2 years dissolved instantly. This was Roosevelt's salami slicing tactic. From 1939 to 1941, he was a patient hunter, setting traps in the Atlantic, tightening the noose in the Pacific, using legal loopholes, geopolitical games, and the madness of his enemies. He dragged a reluctant America into the center of the World War. Some call it conspiracy, some call it deception, but from the height of history, it might be the most brilliant open conspiracy a statesman could make against spreading evil. Because Roosevelt knew, in this jungle world, some wars cannot be avoided. Rather than sit and wait for death, better to lure the enemy in. He sliced away America's neutrality, but in exchange, he bought the survival of the free world.